There is a worrying trend these days. People who unironically believe we should have a king. Not just a ceremonial monarch who waves his staff around and sits still for weird paintings, but a legitimate king with actual legitimate powers. Now, this is not a major trend, especially not in the United States of America, but in the Western world, including Europe, this strange fringe of the far right is growing steadily in prominence. One channel that fits this description is Lavader, who, as far as I can tell, isn't a bad guy at all. He just is wrong about monarchy. So today, how about we look at a video by Lavader, the largest monarchist YouTube channel. Let's do a good faith analysis of his arguments, let's look at them honestly, and show exactly why they're wrong. And for his fans, who are probably typing furious comments down below, if you want to have a good understanding of the world, you have to open your ears to opinions that might disagree with you. I don't expect to convince you, but I hope you finish the video with at least an understanding of the weaknesses of monarchy as a political system. In this video, I'm not going to be arguing the UK or any other European democracy should abolish their ceremonial monarchies. I don't really care. If I see any comments about the Netherlands or Norway, thank you for leaving a free comment and promoting the video without even watching it. No, I'm arguing that giving actual political power to a king, which Lavader wants to do, is a bad idea. Kings can be fun, they can be cool in movies, but I don't want a hereditary dynast to determine how much tax the government takes out of my paycheck or whether or not my country should go to war. And you shouldn't either. You and I, as full-grown adult human beings, deserve to have a say in those things by voting for our leaders. If you already agree with me, then great. Take these arguments, and if you ever see someone claiming monarchy should be applied to your country, you can use these arguments against them. This is what, why, how, and that's what the video's about. If you like this sort of thing, don't forget to subscribe, and if you like this little community we're building here, why not join our Discord? Oh, and one last bit of shilling. This video focuses on Lavader, but if you'd like to read my dissection of the United Monarchist Party of America, you can find that on my Patreon. Okay, that's enough. Let's get into the video. Let's talk about Lavader. This fella is a national conservative Bosnian. Now, right off the bat, you might be thinking of a certain interwar ideological strain, but Lavader is strongly committed to opposing the F word. So what does Lavader believe? Well, he wants what he describes as a semi-constitutional monarchy, one where the king doesn't have absolute power, but significant power. So somewhere between Britain and Saudi Arabia, or judging from his videos and tweets, the German Empire. For clarity, the Kaiser in the German imperial constitution had greater powers than the United States president does in the American constitution, since the German legislature had no power to check the emperor or his executive branch. And of course, the German Kaiser obviously wasn't elected, but inherited the position and held it for life, or at least until he lost the First World War. If this video gets 1,500 likes, I'll cover his videos on the Kaiser, so why not click the little button down there if you'd like this sort of thing. Anyways, unlike the last few debunk videos I've done, Lavader doesn't want blood to run through the streets of New York City, he just has weird ideas that need a good response since more and more people support them. Let's chat about Lavader's video, Refuting Misconceptions about Monarchism. After some introductory chatting, Lavader addresses the first of these misconceptions that he wants to talk about.
Without further ado, let's address our very first myth about monarchism. We will start off with perhaps the most famous claim about monarchism, and that monarchism is just too expensive. Why should we pay money to one man who can then choose to spend it on whatever he wants? Now, not only is the claim that all tax money goes to the monarch completely false, but also that it doesn't really work that way, and it's not as black and white as it may seem. Let's take the United Kingdom as an example. Currently, the government pays around £100 million each year to maintain the royal family, which means that an average British citizen pays the royal family around £4.5 each year through taxes, which is certainly not a lot.
Okay, so I'm just going to pause right there. He goes on to point out that the British royals actually rake in more pounds than they burn. This is actually debatable since there's extra expenses beyond, but there's also extra income from tourism. On the other hand, the Palace of Versailles, built by the French kings, does get plenty of tourism too, and France got rid of their monarch 150 years ago, so maybe you can still get tourists to visit your country without paying for King Charles to get pedicures. But you know what, I'm wasting my breath because this whole conversation is stupid. Lavader is dragging the British monarch, whose chief power is attracting tourism, into the entire political category of monarchism and pretending the budget complaints about the milquetoast ceremonial costumed British kings are the same complaints people make about actual powerful monarchs like the corrupt king of Saudi Arabia. If I were to make a list of criticisms for powerful kings, the expenses are like the 20th worst part. Again, Lavader thinks kings should have actual political power, making the whole first section of your video on why this form of government is good, about how the British royals actually produce a profit in a democracy, is an act of argumentative laundering. That's like if I made a video debunking criticisms of the Bush political dynasty and only talked about Billy. Anyways, after a good chunk of chatting about the subject, he says,
under monarchies, the monarch has to think in terms of his or her lifespan. If he taxes the nation into poverty in just a couple years, he'll become destitute. If he wants to pass the state to his children, he needs to have a long-time preference, because they are like owners of property. Since the state is theirs, they don't want to damage it and are encouraged to tax the minimum needed to achieve his desired living standards/goals, and then leave the rest of the economy to maximize its growth, so they can work on long-time projects that will affect positively the nation and don't cause problems for when their children will rule.
Okay, let's pause there for a second. If what he's saying is true, then there wouldn't ever be inflation or high taxes or debt in kingdoms, right? Since monarchs must act responsibly, right? Can you think of any example of a monarchy going into debt? I can. Kingdoms faced plenty of economic troubles throughout history. The most famous revolution that toppled a king, the French Revolution, was a direct response to the drastic financial situation the kings of France dragged their kingdom into. You can read more about this in the French Revolution and Economic Interpretation, which I linked below, but any academic history you'd read about that revolution would cover this. I'm pretty sure I learned this in elementary school. The Kingdom of France spent billions funding adventurous foreign wars, including the American Revolution. While great for us Americans, this drove their kingdom into debt. But this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. The worsening financial situation of France didn't start in the late 1700s, but in the late 1600s. King Louis XIV waged 3 major land wars against his enemies on the continent for very little gains. Now make a note that this so-called Sun King ruled France for 72 years. We'll come back to that. Anyways, in order to pay for a century of bloodshed, the kings of France imposed taxes not on the aristocratic rich nobles that benefited the most from the wars and held the most personal wealth, but commoners like you and me and Lavader too. French kings, rather than challenge the power of the aristocracy, imposed new taxes on salt, created new domestic tolls across France, and so on. These taxes strangled the class of people in France that actually produced things of worth, the commoners, because the privileged nobility was literally excused from paying the tax. So when a bad agricultural harvest happened in the year 1789, farmers still had to pay their taxes, which meant the price of food spiked. That year, the King of France at last gathered representatives of the different classes together to address the dire financial situation. From there, everything spiraled, and the rest is history. So believe it or not, in real life, we have several kings of one of the most powerful countries in Europe acting extremely irresponsibly for personal glory, draining the treasury of funds, then imposing huge taxes on regular people to pay for all of it. That's what caused the French Revolution. Now, is financial crisis unique to 1700s France? Of course not. Plenty of other kingdoms suffer from them. Just Google any revolution or civil war in a kingdom and poor fiscal policy is a likely culprit. Is financial crisis unique to monarchies? No, republics can have them too. Lavader's argument, however, is that none of this happens in monarchies, generally speaking, because they are just inherently more responsible. I don't buy it. You can't just rely on vibes and vague fantasies of personal responsibility to make an argument about political systems. Where is the data? All the most successful, happiest, most stable countries in the world today are democracies, some of which have ceremonial monarchies, of course, but those have no power. There's a reason for this. Anyways, monarchists, where is your data? I will believe you if you show me a large research project that compares a large sample of democracies and powerful monarchies in similar circumstances to see which had superior fiscal policy. None of you will, though, because your ideology is not based on data, but instead a rebellious fantasy. It doesn't help your argument either when you can't cite any successful powerful monarchy today besides Saudi Arabia and Jordan, two American colonies, since all your favorite monarchies collapsed into chaos when they threw Europe into bloody war 100 years ago. Where's the personal responsibility there? Monarchists need to read more history, but you know what? Let's keep watching, and maybe some of you monarchists watching will learn more history.
No democratic leader owns their society, and so has no incentive to think beyond the next election. And this is why politicians are so negligent with spending, inflation, debt, and unlike a king and his heirs, democratic leaders don't have to deal with the consequences of their actions, so to maximize their impact, they begin to spend as much money as quickly as possible before their term expires, thus destroying the whole nation.
I feel like Lavader gets his talking points from 1789. Democratically elected leaders don't just immediately steal money from the treasury and run wild. You need taxes or loans to pay for government programs, and as the United States shows, plenty of democratically elected leaders are reluctant to raise taxes or borrow money because we the people don't like it when they do that. There's a reason why the US budget, while ginormous, isn't a quadrillion dollars. Anyways, remember when I told you to make a note of something? King Louis XIV, the Sun King, ruled France for 72 years. Well, you know what, he technically ruled for 64 years. Since his first decade on the throne he was a child, but you get the point. Despite having the scepter for more years than many people live, he still dragged France into debt. He didn't have to worry about re-election, he wasn't in office for just a few years, but he still left a major problem for his 5-year-old grandson who inherited the throne. Oh, by the way, that grandson, King Louis XV, dragged France further into debt with foreign wars. Plenty of kings have acted irresponsibly throughout history. That's because for true powerful kings, there are very few limits on their power. They can drag their kingdoms into prolonged duress, unwilling to exit to serve their own personal self-gain, while a democratically elected leader would sooner or later be voted out of office, ending that duress. Here's some proof. This is a chart of American soldiers in Iraq. President George Bush, America's very own Sun King, brought the US into massive, expensive wars. In 2008, the American people, sick of the war, voted into office Barack Obama, who pulled out of Iraq. A similar story played out in Afghanistan. That is the power of democracy. If we the people care enough about an issue, we can change what our government does. That's a good thing. But imagine this. If George Bush was president for life, or King of America, well then we may still have 100,000 soldiers in Iraq. Unlike what Lavader says, democratically elected leaders actually do have to deal with the consequences of their actions. They can be voted out of power, or in George Bush's case his party, and a new guy can be brought in to fix the mess of the last person. For monarchies, you have to wait until the king dies, or if there's a revolution, and King W is looking pretty healthy to me.
And the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, anyway.
Let's move on.
This is probably one of the most popular arguments against a monarchy. Why should someone, by virtue of being born to the right parents, have the right to exert power, whether absolute or not, over anyone else? I want to answer this with one simple question. Is there a completely fair way for someone to get into a high position of power, no matter the means? Why should someone who said the right kind of words to the right kind of people hold power over the entire nation, and not to mention the numerous ways these people get into positions of power in a republic? And I am not just talking about votes. Just because someone, for example, became president of a democratic nation through seemingly democratic means, doesn't mean that they got that position 100% fairly. Think about all the times these people used corruption to their advantage, how they can be greedy, and just how many times they lied to the very people that got them into power. But sure, it is more fair just because more people approve of them.
This is such an incredibly weak argument. Are all elections in republics fair? No. As Lavader says, politicians can cheat and lie. But even if 1% of elections are fair, that's better than a monarchy where you have a 0% say in who the king is. He's literally criticizing democracies for being too close to monarchies, then saying that makes monarchies better. Which is it? At least medieval monarchies had the balls to say God gave them the right to rule. Also, Lavader does this thing where he confuses what fair means. When a politician cheats in democracy, it's unfair because they're twisting the rules. They're violating our right to have a say in who leads us. When a king inherits the throne, not on the basis of any actual personal merit, but just on his blood, nobody's twisting the rules. It's unfair because it's unjust. The rule book itself is rotten. A king should not have power because we, the people, those who make up this country, who have the inherent right to have a say in how our government is organized, did not give him that power. Let's see what he says next.
A monarch, or specifically an heir, doesn't need to start a campaign, lie to his people, and use corruption because his position of power is already solidified from the very moment he or she exists in his mother's womb. In this case, all that needs to be done is to educate the young heir on how to run the nation as he gets older, and most of the time, monarchs who were educated from a young age on what to do and how to run the nation when they get into power have a higher possibility of being better rulers than a president who got into office from absolutely no previous experience or knowledge on what to do in that position.
This is an argument I've seen a lot, and it is a bad one. Yes, in well-off countries, the heir to the throne does receive a pretty good education, because why not? His family is wealthy enough that even if they didn't have a crown, he'd go to a good university at least.
I have a deep love for Africa.
But guess what? The same is true for most elected leaders, because you have to be smart and competent to get elected for the most part. What special esoteric training did King Charles get that any other well-educated politician, many of whom are law school graduates, historians, or experts in business or other fields, did not get over the course of their life? Not only that, but every US president except for one had experience serving in government or the military, which is the best training you can get, by the way, to, serve in the government or command the military. Joe Biden spent nearly 40 years in the Senate and 8 years as vice president.
I can't go every day, can I?
Which you like better, these or these?
Joe, they're the same.
They capture different moods.
Unless you want your semi-constitutional monarch to govern a state or serve in the legislature, then how could they get such important and relevant experience? There are exceptions, of course. You could vote into power a pretty dumb president. But guess what? There are dumb and incompetent monarchs too. Just look to Thailand or countless other examples of kings consumed by their own vices. The difference between a bad president and a bad king is we the people can vote out the president and get someone smarter in charge. With a king, again, you only have two options: wait for him to die or kill him. None of those are better than just being able to vote him out every few years. Next, Lavader says,
Also, it is important to say that having an heir makes politics and geopolitics much easier in that nation. You cannot rig whoever becomes the next monarch the same way one can rig an election, nor can you say for certain who will win the next election or elections afterwards, unlike in a monarchy where you can say with confidence exactly who will be in charge for the next couple of decades.
Yeah, this isn't how that works. Politics and diplomacy are not easier because you'll know who'll be in charge in 20 years, which, by the way, is the ultimate form of rigging the results, but whatever. Does the United States have an easier time, for example, negotiating with Putin because he won't leave office until he dies? No, in fact, the opposite. Stubborn or delusional rulers for life, and that includes kings, can corrupt their country's domestic and international status irreversibly, and you can't get them off the throne except by violence. Here's a historical example for you. In the late 1800s, European empires loomed over Asia, strengthened by new technologies and hungry for conquest. But in China, Empress Dowager Cixi, the true power in the Qing dynasty, blocked modernization. By the time she died, it was too late for the reformers. China crumbled into civil war, economic domination by Europe, foreign invasion, and eventually the communist revolution too. If China could vote out its leaders back in the 1800s, that wouldn't have happened. So monarchs can be stubborn in the face of change. But when the monarch dies, sometimes at random, you can get a completely new policy overnight. That sort of unpredictability is not good. Let's rewind to 1762 in the midst of the 7 Years' War. Prussia was on the verge of defeat, losing several battles to Austria and Russia. But the Russian Empress Elizabeth died, so the throne passed to her German-born nephew, who became Emperor Peter III. Rather than finish off Prussia and crush a major rival to Russian power, the new emperor, by many accounts a fairly hideous sort of person, decided instead to switch teams, join Prussia, and betray Austria, turning the tide of war and saving Prussia from certain destruction, wasting all the progress Russia had made. His motivation was purely personal. He liked Prussia. Before the end of the year, the extremely unpopular emperor was toppled in a coup by his own wife, Catherine. Could you imagine if something like that happened in America? If when FDR died in April 1945, the presidency passed to some random Roosevelt cousin who decided to switch teams to the Axis? For all the criticisms leveled against American foreign policy, that the country has multiple personality disorder, we haven't done anything as crazy as that. I'm sure you can think of other examples of monarchs making drastic changes. Comment them down below. Okay, but let's move on. He talks for a bit about the differences between a democracy and a republic. A democracy is a society where the people have a substantial say in their government, like by voting for representatives or directly for policies. America is a democracy, but it's also a republic. So what's a republic? Well, I'd say it's a representative democracy without a king, where people vote for a legislature and a chief executive. But monarchists like to play a rhetorical trick, where everything that doesn't have a crown is a republic. So not just the United States, but also undemocratic dictatorships like the Third Reich and Stalin's Soviet Union. I'll show you an example of Lavader making that argument later, but if you want to make that argument, you're just diluting a category so much that you won't be able to actually understand what the category means and how these governments actually work. Putting North Korea and France into the same bucket will confuse you, just as much as if I said all monarchs, including King Charles, are bad because Genghis Khan killed people. Anyways.
If we look at the nations of Europe after the Age of Enlightenment, we will see that the majority of monarchs at the turn of the 20th century were constitutional and had a democratic system already in place, whereas when we look at republics from that point forward, we will find that republics were vastly more authoritarian than your average European monarchy. The truth is, democracy and republicanism are definitely not the same thing. A republic is not always a democracy, as history has shown us with countries like the USSR, Yugoslavia, the Federal Republic of Austria, and the list goes on.
Again, he's trying to stuff the Third Reich and Stalinist Russia into the same category as interwar France or even America to smear all republics as undemocratic or chaotic or whatever. Let me tell you a little secret. This whole video, my whole argument really, isn't actually about monarchy versus non-monarchy. I don't really care about that. Lavader wants a king with political power. That's not a democratic monarchy, it's an authoritarian monarchy, a powerful monarchy. My argument is actually about democracy versus authoritarianism. Democracy, we the people having a say in who leads us, is a superior form of government to the sort of monarchy that Lavader supports, where power is held by some guy who won the birth lottery. Everyone knows this except the monarchists, who want to dodge criticism by distracting us with Joseph Stalin. There's more about Stalin and other dictators at the end of the video, but next, Lavader says,
by definition, democracy is, quote, a system of government in which the people of a country can elect their representatives, and that is exactly how democracy works in monarchies. While the people cannot vote for the head of state, i.e. the king, they can still very much vote for their representatives. like the Prime Minister, members of Parliament, and also the leaders of their local administration, and then these representatives will work alongside the king to ensure the stability of the country.
Very funny to say monarchies are democratic, people just can't vote for the king. Yeah, the king is kind of important, don't you think? If the king wasn't important, then why are you a monarchist? It is not a democracy if the people have absolutely zero say in a huge part of their government. Okay, the next section of Lavader's video is responding to criticisms that monarchy is outdated. But guess what? You know what? I'm gonna be nice, because I have no response to this. Saying something is bad because it existed in the past is just as dumb as saying something is good because it existed in the past. And monarchists do that, by the way. They argue that monarchy is a natural form of government because we all instinctually understand having a big kahuna with a sparkly hat telling us all what to do. But there's plenty of stuff in nature and history that we all agree is bad, right? Having a powerful monarchy should be one of those things. Anyways, the last major section addresses corruption. He says,
Corruption is one of the biggest issues a government can face, and considering how much people talk about corrupt politicians and rulers, it's no surprise that many like to say that monarchy is a corrupt system in of itself. But it's clear that people don't really understand what corrupt means. Just because someone has political power and is wealthy does not make them inherently corrupt. Nevertheless, if we look at history, we will find that there were indeed a few corrupt kings or emperors, but as I said, only a few. The reason being is that monarchs don't really have a reason to be corrupt. The main reason why people engage in corruption in the first place is because of two things: money and power. But monarchs are already covered with both of these things from the moment they are born, to the moment they let out their last breath. And this is the reason why so many monarchs weren't corrupt, simply because they didn't need to engage in corruption. Now some may point to a few monarchs like King Louis XVI and Nicholas II, whose countries were embroiled in revolution due to their quote-unquote corruption of hosting parties and presumably not caring about the lower classes. But that isn't corruption, it's just negligence, and most people confuse acts of negligence for acts of corruption.
Okay, Lavader completely missed the point. He's so close to getting it, but he just doesn't. It's not just a few bad apples, monarchy is peak corruption. Twisting public finances for your own private self-gain is the entire basis of monarchy. Every extraordinary palace, every fancy outfit, every expensive painting, every gold coin, just for being born with the last name of the last guy who won a war 250 years ago, is corrupt. Actually, it's not just corruption, it's rule by the sword. The strong eat and the weak are meat. Kings have no legitimacy, really, besides force. Oh, also, even in ceremonial monarchies, the royal family tends to be pretty corrupt. King Juan Carlos of Spain literally resigned the throne because of a gigantic corruption scandal. That's not from the 1700s, that's from 2014. Same thing with other monarchies across the planet. Just look at the House of Saud. Next, Lavader says that republics have much worse corruption. Again, there's no proof or statistics for this, it's just vibes. He just thinks that's the case. Monarchists, come back with actual proof. This only makes sense as an argument if you ignore the inherent corruption of monarchy as a system of government in the first place. In the end, if you want a less corrupt government, maybe there's a better way than appointing a hereditary monarch who is above the law. Maybe pass better laws, or give corruption investigators greater authority. I don't know about you, but that seems to me like an easier, better solution. Anyways, let's see how he concludes his video.
As I have demonstrated, monarchism can be far more complicated than just a guy sitting in a castle with a lot of money. And people think that the position of a monarch is a privilege, but this assumption is far from right. Truth of the matter is, being a king is one of the most difficult positions a man can find himself in. A king stands alone against all who wish harm upon his people. He, without a sense of safety, has to have the will and duty to fight against all the evil in the world. Think about this and all the burdens this man has to carry, the expectations he needs to meet, and the duty that he has. Think of all this next time you envy the position of a monarch. As Sir Fulke Greville stated, quote, The greatest slave in a kingdom is generally the king of it. End quote.
Gosh, if it was really such a drag to be king, you think nobody would have fought any civil wars to claim any throne, would they? In fact, they'd be fighting civil wars to make sure the other guy got stuck with it. And it really sounds quite noble, the idea of a king standing alone against all the evil in the world. But in reality, kings, like any other politician, like any other human, are self-interested. They wanted and want to maximize their power, which is why kings feuded constantly with other politicians, nobles, in their countries, and with their neighbors abroad. Every single monarchist argument is based on an imaginary, uncorruptible, hyper-masculine, giga-chad Christian patriot who'd go without rest to see their nation win. But guess what? Every king has been a human being. Every king has had flaws, some much more than others. Even if you get a king who is like 90% okay, which is rare, what's to say he won't have a rotten son? Conservatives, what if the king's a liberal hippie? Did you ever think about that? What if the king dies when his son is an infant? History is full of kingdoms splitting apart into civil war over who should inherit the throne, or who should control little baby infant kings. But anyways, let's take a moment to talk about the world's purest monarchy, North Korea. Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of North Korea, inherited the throne from his father, Kim Jong-il, who inherited the throne from his father, Kim Il-sung, who was put into power by a foreign occupation and a civil war. Even though North Korea calls itself a democratic people's republic, if you actually believe North Korea is a democracy, you're delusional. So what is it? Well, you can make a pretty good argument it's a hereditary monarchy, but ultimately my point in this section is to point out the labels countries apply to themselves are just aesthetic. It doesn't matter if Kim Jong-un or any other dictator wears a crown, or a weird haircut, or a big fancy hat, whether they call themselves Kaiser, or Sultan, or King, or Raj, or President, or whatever. What matters is the actual extent and scope of their power. If you look at the material reality, these so-called semi-constitutional monarchies like the German Empire or modern-day Morocco and Jordan are fundamentally materially identical to any other authoritarian, yet not absolute, dictatorship of today or the past. The same goes for absolute monarchies. There is very little difference in the level and extent of power between Mao or any other powerful Chinese emperor, or between Stalin and any other powerful Russian emperor. It's all authoritarianism, crown or no crown. Now, I've been to Bosnia, I've even seen Alexander, Crown Prince of Yugoslavia, but I'm not a Bosnian. Lavader has the right to argue Bosnia should have back its king, but he doesn't just talk about Bosnia. He talks in general terms about why monarchy is good. I don't think having a powerful king would be good for any country in the Western world. So with the video approaching its end, let's take a moment to talk about an alternative to powerful monarchies and dictatorships. The representative democracy. First, are you a sentient adult? Don't you have the right to have some say in whether or not your country goes to war, or how much tax is taken out of your paycheck? Well, guess what? I've got just the system of government for you, the representative democracy. What's that? You don't believe in human rights, even of your own? Okay, well, how about this? As a sentient adult, you have some understanding of what sort of policies would be best for you, right? What about your adult family members or adult neighbors? They probably know basically what's good for themselves, right? Now imagine you wrote all of that knowledge down on a piece of paper and balanced it out, canceling negatives and positives. Well, on that paper would, more or less, be what is best for your neighborhood and your family as a whole. Now imagine you do that on a national scale. That piece of paper you end up with would basically say what is best for your country, which after all is made up of millions of individuals like yourself. That's what voting is. By everyone voting for a representative they think would best represent their interests, then sending them all to a big room, we can get a good sense of what sort of policies are best for the country, more or less. Now wait a moment, you might say. Lavader does believe in having a legislative branch, just the executive branch should be a monarchy. Well, why does the same principle of representation not apply to the executive branch? By all of us voting for a single executive leader, or in the case of a parliament, the legislature voting for a single executive, the prime minister, wouldn't that person represent what the majority of adult citizens think is in their self-interest, more or less? Which, if we assume people aren't complete idiots, is actually the interest of the majority of the country, actually. But wait, you might say, People are complete idiots. They can be swayed by momentary trends, by clickbait news articles. Well, like I just said, people at least have a pretty good sense of what's best for themselves. And by everyone voting, we can figure out what's best for the country. And besides, I'm not really advocating for direct democracy. Nobody really wants to have a national referendum on every bill. People are busy, they're not experts on trade law or taxes, so we vote into office representatives to figure out those issues. We don't need a republic of genius philosophers for democracy to work pretty well. And skeptics, just your luck, we can have elections every few years, and we can keep having them every few years. That way momentary fads don't drastically change our government. How about we have a big document, call it a constitution, that limits what these elected leaders can do? How about we have 3 equal branches, one to make laws, one to enforce laws, and one to interpret laws, to balance power? So if one goes crazy, the other 2 can fix it. Well, you say we need a strong executive to lead the country. Okay, you know what, fine. We can have that. But here's a crazy idea. What if we could get all the positives of a strong executive, but none of the negatives of making that executive position inherited to whoever happens to be the eldest son of the last guy, who could after all be a wacko, or a freak, or a loser? We already established elections are a pretty good way to interpret what the national interest is. So what if we voted for the chief executive too? Now the executive does need time to actually do his job, so maybe every 4 years he has to come before the people for a performance review, where we could hire him again or fire him. We could also choose someone else, whoever most of us agree is best for the job. What the heck, there you go, I found a compromise solution. Well, you say, I really like kings, they're cool. You know what, that's fine. You can have a king, you can have all the robes and crowns and religious services, you can have your symbol of national unity. But if you take that symbol and dip him in the filthy mud of partisan politics, you're just gonna split the country even worse than it ever has been. Kings throughout history faced countless civil wars, faced revolutions over political squabbles. If you want a king so bad, fine. But it serves your interest best to keep him out of politics. But you say kings fought so many civil wars because it was a different time. You can't judge them based on modern standards. But modernity didn't just pop out of nowhere. Democracy made the modern world. It made the phone or the computer you're watching this video on. It brought us to the moon. It's why you can read. It's why you're not a serf trudging and digging in the mud. There's a reason why the best countries to live in have elected leaders. Going backwards to monarchy would undo that progress, would undo the toil of countless generations who fought for the rights that you today enjoy. But anyways, comment your thoughts below and don't forget to like and subscribe. Now I could talk a bit about the United Monarchist Party of America, which actually has a specific platform for an American monarchy, but this video's gone on a bit too long. Instead, I've put the script on Patreon, which you can join for just $1 a month. Thanks to those who already support the channel. User SEQ Caliber, Lehan Whale, Goblin, Lily, 7-Zip, Sean, Lars, Vanderchromia, Jared, Omega, Quincy, Dionisio, Wheatless, Benjamin, Basit, Mimo, Lord Dan, Samab, Drehair, Channel 101, Freddy, Party, South Africa, Help Africa, Aaron, Panksad, LHC, Gentle, Trudeau, Tio, Kenshi, Brand, and Andrea. Thanks, and adios.